Hello, everybody. I'm not sure where you are, but you're all over the world, and this is exciting. And on behalf of the Yale International Alliance, I'd like to welcome all of our participants today, located in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe, to our inaugural series of YA talks called In Conversation With. My name is Caroline Van Pearson 79. I'm a board member of the Yale International Alliance, or YIA, an alumni shared interest group whose mission is to celebrate the international experience and inspire the global community to address the issues of our time. Today, author, journalist, and Yale alum class of '88, Carla Power, will share her new book, Home, Land, Security, Deradicalization and the Journey Back from Extremism. Her book is timely and written before the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. She addresses why youth and adults are becoming radicalized at home and abroad, and how societies can rehabilitate extremists and terrorists. To engage Carla in this discussion, we are pleased to have with us Beth Gardiner, another award-winning journalist, author, and Yale alum. Both Carla and Beth reside in London. I'd like to say a few words about Beth, who will in turn introduce Carla. Beth Gardiner is an environmental journalist. Her award-winning book, Choked: Life and Breath in the Age of Air Pollution, made the Guardian's Best of 2019 list. Beth wrote the cover story for National Geographic's April 2021 issue, and her work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, HuffPost, Yale Environment 360, and Smithsonian. As a former longtime AP reporter, her assignments included reporting from the Middle East during a flare-up of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and flying on Tony Blair's plane to write about prime ministerial trips to China, India, and Washington. She's a two-time fellow of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and Beth is a member of the Yale class of '93. We'd like to ask you to please pose your questions in the Q&A box on the Zoom Q&A box, and we will try to address as many as possible during the last 15 minutes of this hour. And now over to Beth and Carla.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Caroline. And thank you for having me. It is a real honor and a pleasure to be here with Carla Power to talk about her brilliant new book. Carla is not only a fellow Yale and fellow American transplanted for a very long time in the UK, but also a dear friend and someone whose work I have admired for a very long time. Carla, after graduating from Yale, got her master's in Middle Eastern Studies from Oxford, picked up another master's degree in journalism at Columbia. She has devoted a large part of her career, the large part of her career, to coverage of the Muslim world. She spent many years as a correspondent for Newsweek, covering Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, again with a focus on Muslim and Arab societies. Since she left Newsweek, Carla's been a very prolific and successful freelance writer. Her work has appeared in a really wide range of publications, including Vogue, Time, the New York Times Magazine, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy. Her first book came out in 2015, If the Oceans Were Ink, An Unlikely Friendship and a Journey to the Heart of the Quran. And that was an account of the year that Carla spent studying Quran with a traditional Islamic scholar who was also a friend of hers from her time at Oxford. If the Oceans Were Ink was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. So it was not easy to follow that up, but Carla has done it. Her new book, Home, Land, Security, Deradicalization and the Journey Back from Extremism, was published just a couple of months ago to coincide with the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And indeed, Carla explores the impact of that day and of the US response to 9/11, the war on terror, very deeply in its pages. this book really could not be more relevant in these very polarized times, and I really looking forward to this conversation. We're going to explore some of the roots of extremism, what lures people into radicalization, and what has worked and not worked to try to de-radicalize and bring people back from the brink of political violence. I just want to say one thing about this book before we start our conversation. What I just described, this is obviously, it sounds like a pretty heavy, serious topic, and of course it is. But Homeland Security is really, I have to say, also a total page turner. Carla is such a deep reporter, such an elegant writer. She has traveled around the world, and you're going to hear a little bit about those travels, to find some really extraordinary human stories. And she pairs them with quite a bit of personal introspection as well, always kind of examining her own eye for any kind of preconceptions or bias. And I just found that so valuable and so moving as a reader. So, I know from participating in these kinds of events as an audience member, sometimes as an author or as an interviewer, that you can sometimes kind of come away from a talk like this and kind of think, oh, well, that was really interesting. I learned a lot about this topic, and now I know about radicalization and de-radicalization, and I don't really need to read anything about it. But please do yourself the favor of actually spending some time with this book, because there is so much more there than we're going to be able to get through in this hour-long conversation. But I hope we'll give you a taste of it, and I really do encourage you. As I said, it just really kept me turning the pages. So that is a real reflection of Carla's achievement in writing it. So I know that Zoom fatigue, Zoom overdose is a real thing. So we're going to try to keep this pretty strictly to an hour. As Caroline said, we're going to leave some time for questions, audience questions at the end. So please do share those, any questions you may have or comments for Carla in the Q&A function, and I will keep an eye on that, and I will pose those questions to her as we get sort of hit about 45 minutes or so. Anyway, I've asked Carla, and she's agreed to start with a little bit of a reading. So I hope that will give you a taste of the prose in this book, and just how engaging it is. And then we will move on to our conversation. So Carla, over to you. Take it away. Give us
take it away. And so I'm, I can die happy now, because your lovely introduction from a writer I admire so much is fantastic. And I want to thank Caroline and Peggy and Victoria and you for making the time to pull this off. So thank you. It's just a real pleasure to be here.
Likewise.
I am starting, I'll read a little bit from the introduction about how this whole project sort of started. I'll just dive right in. A week spent in Texas, a few days after Donald Trump's inauguration, began the journey that would eventually become this book. A Dallas group interested in international affairs had invited me to speak about the subject of my first book, If the Oceans Were Ink. I was hoping the evening would be a refuge from all the talk in the news that winter about hatred and high walls and closed borders. And when I walked in, the first signs were reassuring. In a building designed by M.Phil, a soigné crowd picked at cheese and fruit. The group's president, a banker, chatted in French with a Parisian. A Palestinian-American doctor and an Algerian-American businesswoman conferred about an upcoming gala. I wrote Oceans to illustrate that Islam is a just human faith, a far cry from the intolerance and violence of militant groups that make the news headlines. I've been challenged on the thesis before, but surveying the cosmopolitan crowd that night in Dallas, I'd hoped I'd be spared. As it turned out, I was mistaken. In the Q&A session, an elderly man, rail thin, raised his hand. "You have not once in your whole talk mentioned jihad," he said accusingly. "I have here from the internet a list of things Islam says about it." He unfolded a sheaf of papers and proceeded to read a quote from the Quran. "Then kill the idolaters wherever you find them." Yes, I cut him off briskly. "That's the so-called verse of the sword. Islamophobes and jihadis both love to use it, since it seems to legitimize violence." Reader, I must confess, I went all school marm on him. I'd heard this argument before, a handful of phrases cherry-picked from the Quran, thrown down triumphantly. The verse is all too often taken out of context, both historically and textually, I intoned, my face pinkening. If one were to read the entire passage, not just the lines you quoted, one would actually find that, like so much in the Quran, it counsels mercy. What's rarely mentioned, I continued, is the verse's second half. But if they repent and keep up prayer and give alms, then let them go free. For God is most forgiving, most merciful. In other words, make peace if your enemy does. Moreover, I continued, the verse shouldn't be used as a blanket statement about how to deal with non-Muslims. Both the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's sayings contain repeated entreaties for tolerance of Jews and Christians. The verse of the sword was revealed to the Prophet at a particular moment in Islamic history, when the early Muslim community was facing off in battle against a very specific group of non-believers. The man folded up his papers, sighing and frowning, presumably at my naivete. "Next question?" I asked, a shade too eagerly.
Okay, thank you, Carla. That was such a good place to start. And I want to start my end of the conversation by going a little bit deeper on some of the issues that you raised in that passage. And I think it is such a good example of what I was talking about at the beginning, the way that you're constantly sort of questioning your own assumptions and preconceptions. And this was a big one. You have spent a lot of your career, as I said in my introduction, writing about Islam, writing about the Muslim world, and really trying to give readers who are your readers mostly in the West, a more nuanced view of this religion that is so often gets portrayed in this really one-dimensional way. And as you just sort of fessed up there, you were resistant for a long time to talking about this other side that gets so much of the coverage, the non-Carla Power coverage in our mass media about Islam and relation to terrorism and radicalization. And you very understandably did not want to add to that caricature, a few bad apples kind of ruining the whole image of a billion people. So can you talk a little bit about, why you were, as a journalist, reluctant to report and talk and write about jihadis, radicalization and terrorism for so long, and also how that changed, and why you decided that it actually was important to take on some of these issues, which originally went so much against the grain for you?
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of, for so long, as you say, I didn't want to pile on, especially as Islamophobia was rising, certainly in both the United States and England, where we live. And I was like, no, let me write about the mainstream. Let me write about, peaceful, kind, neighborly, all the good things about Islam. And when people would ask me, I'd be like, look, terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. There are groups attracted to political violence in every group you can find, from
Sure, which is true.
Which is true, exactly. But somehow Muslim political violence tends to get exponentially more coverage. And so I was almost in a sort of see no evil, hear no evil kind of state kind of thing,
Right.
where I just like, let's talk about the good stuff. And I was fine with that and rather smug about that, I think, until I was actually talking the day after this, the passage I read, I went to University of Texas at Austin, and there was, I started speaking to somebody, and a very thoughtful young woman raised her hand and said, listen, why is it that liberals like you, and I'm, a card-carrying liberal, it's probably obvious. Why do you never want to talk about extremism? Why do you never want to engage with the very real problem of political violence, small as it is? Because what you're doing is basically leaving the road, leaving all the discourse to the extremists. It's either the Islamophobes or it's the violent extremists themselves who are sending out messaging. And this kind of daintiness is not necessarily serving anybody. And I realized that by not engaging, I was kind of keeping the monster under the bed. And it was time to really try to drill down into how monstrous he or she really was, and to do justice to the root causes of extremism, and also the possibilities for dynamism and change within people so that they could get out of it.
Right. So that was so interesting, because obviously part of this caricatured portrayal that we are so used to of kind of, quotes, Muslim extremists in our media is this, just, you call it in the book, the ultimate othering, that terrorists are the ultimate others. There's this idea of just they're pure evil, unredeemable, mass violence. We don't even engage with it at all. Mm-hmm. So what interested you at first in that idea of terrorists as the ultimate others, as these kind of ultimate, monsters? And why did you decide to start kind of questioning those framings? And I guess the other half of that question is why does this matter? Why do we need to understand how radicalization happens, and why should we see it as a nuanced thing, that people are human, even if they're terrorists? Why not just brush them off as, black and white, good and evil?
Well, I remember,
a lot of people want to do that, particularly
it's so much easier to construct them as entirely evil. And despite the fact that the acts they commit, I'm not condoning them at all, I should say up front. But it seems to me that as we constructing the terrorist as a monster hasn't served us well in terms of security. Mm-hmm. We've as our $2 trillion debacle, where we fought against the Taliban to replace them with the Taliban over 20 years, seems to me to be a lesson in the importance of digging down and understanding, and really, really breaking down the reasons that people are going towards these groups. And that it's very comfortable to sit and say, this is just evil, or even this is just terrorism. But, let us remember that terrorism is a moving target. I mean, the US Army once came up with 100 definitions for terror, what terrorism is. And, there's a great quote from a 20th century English MP who said, no, yesterday's terrorist always ends up sitting at the Dorchester Hotel on the bill of Her Majesty's government, basically. Right. I.e., yesterday's terrorist is often today's statesman. And of course, that's true. I mean, look at and vice versa, actually. Right. You look at the 1980s, when, you know, the people Osama bin Laden was fighting with were praised as freedom fighters, and we gave them a lot of our hard-earned tax dollars. And at the same time, Nelson Mandela was in prison for alleged terrorism. So it's a moving target. It changes with time. And it's very politicized constantly, as we, you know, we're living in an era when, you know, the Chinese are locking up the Uyghurs, claiming that they are going to de-radicalize them. So it's a very, we've got to examine both how that term is constructed, the context that on the ground contexts that are forcing people, not forcing people, but are leading people to join these militant groups, and also question the stereotype that once a terrorist, always a terrorist.
Okay. And I want to talk a little bit more about that and all the different ways that people find their way towards radicalization. But I first wanted to ask you about something else, because what I said in the beginning is really true, that the thing that struck me in this book was that you were constantly sort of saying like, hey, wait a minute, I'm looking at this wrong, like, or I'm missing something. I just found that time and again. And then you push yourself kind of to the next level of understanding and to kind of widen your lens ever further. And it actually really starts on the first page of the book, before the passage that you just read to us, this kind of self-examination, self-questioning, and looking at your own preconceptions. And the thing that you bring up at the beginning is sort of this moment right after Trump is elected and inaugurated in 2016 and 2017, and kind of seeing some parallels between yourself and your own kind of, you know, suddenly way that you're finding yourself looking at the world, and our politics, and, you know, particularly in this moment of polarization, but both here in the UK and in the States, you're seeing parallels between your kind of worldview and people who are, you know, joining ISIS. So that seems like a weird, you know, a big stretch, I guess. So can you tell us a little bit more about what parallels you saw there, and then how did that inform you going forward as you actually started to meet with radicals, former radicals, or, you know, parents was where you started, mothers of people who become radicalized?
Yeah, I mean, I just remember, you know, those months after November, when Trump was elected, and I had just started researching what are some of the typical sort of things that people feel when they are becoming radicalized. And I was like, wait, okay, I'm lying awake, staring at the ceiling, seething with anger and frustration.
Right.
Really shutting down listening to other people with other worldviews, or who with other opinions, just not wanting to hear it because I was so angry and so frustrated, and being disillusioned with my own sort of my own nation. And if that sort of narrowing of my worldview, until I was relatively intolerant for a while, if not, you know, it's a work in progress. But you know, if that was happening to me, it certainly echoed what I was reading about with these young kids who were going off in a sort of rigid, intolerant, and quite angry sometimes, although I should stress that everybody's, you know, people join for a whole raft of reasons, and it's very individualistic. But the other thing that I sort of saw around, and I'm seeing, you know, as I was working on this, was that many of the body politic was suffering from this same issues that I see kind of pushing people towards violent extremism abroad, in places like Pakistan or Nigeria or Indonesia, right, where you know, there was polarization, a sort of tribal, not that these countries are necessarily tribal, but that people were sticking to their own groups. There was a growing sense of frustration at corruption, an erosion of faith in laws and institutions, and that sort of protection. All of these larger socioeconomic issues are some of the reasons that the problem of violent extremism has arisen in other parts of the world. And I started looking around the Anglo-American cultures that we're steeped in, and seeing similar issues rising there. So,
and did you feel like, having seen that in yourself, that sort of little bit of kind of intolerance and a readiness to kind of close off to alternative worldviews, did that help you in a way to at least be more open to being ready to hear the stories of these people whose stories you did, start to hear, why a kid living in the north of England might run off to Syria to join ISIS? Did it give you more of a...
Well, there was as you say, it was a rolling kind of like, oh wait, here I'm confronting a prejudice. Like, when I guess, when I went up to see Nicola, the first mother I talked to was in the north of England, and her son had run off to join ISIS. We may even have a picture of her, I think.
We do have a picture of her,
but it may not be. So there's Nicola, and you see the stilettos, you see the pearls, and of course my own prejudice. I was going up on the train, and I had to meet her at Birmingham train station, and after decades of trying to write against stereotypes of Muslims, I literally stood on, in Birmingham, scanning for this woman who was going to pick me up, and I assumed she would be, in maybe in niqab, in full covering, maybe in, very stern. And of course, Nicola bounces up with stiletto heels and a Welsh brogue,
Right, yeah.
And so that was just an instance of my feeling like, oh, you think you're so open-minded. Well, there's another tripwire. And and it happened. I also went up, and this was sort of in the thick of everybody hearing about the real atrocities that ISIS was perpetrating. That, their propaganda, people burned alive and people thrown off buildings and really horrible stuff. So I, in the back of my mind, I was like, what kind of woman would raise a monster like this? Yeah. And of course, the monster.
So even you have these ideas in your head.
Yeah, exactly. And it, you just have to chip away and check them as you keep asking questions and keep remaining curious. But.
Yeah. So, like I said, I think that the thing that is so engaging about this book is the stories and the people that you find. And you did sort of say that you use the idea of, or this sort of shared territory of motherhood as a way in to, your a bridge towards your first effort. Nicola was the first person you met, I think, in reporting this book, who was a family member of someone who'd run off to join an extremist violent group. You used motherhood as your sort of common ground with her in a way. So can you tell us a little bit about Rashid, her son, this British kid who one morning was gone and turned up in Raqqa, I think. And I wanted to ask you in particular, in the course of telling us his story, if you could be sure to mention this thing that was just so striking to me as a reader, but I know also to you and to Nicola in your conversation with her, these phone and text messages that she had gotten from him. There was one message in particular that was very striking. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. We started talking about Rashid, and I assumed he was, a hardened ideologue, and I had all these images of
Right.
beetle-browed men rushing around in trucks. And of course I get there and she starts showing me pictures of this kid. I mean, this genuine kid who evidently loved parkour, and as Nicola describes him, was a true innocent. I mean, there was a real Peter Pan quality to him. And granted, I know as good journalists, we should be skeptical of mothers' accounts of their children. But she told this story.
It's an interesting perspective, though.
Yeah, exactly. It's an interesting perspective. And the reason I started with mothers is they take, unlike the security lens, which is about let's stay safe right now, a mother has a long-term vision. A mother knew them, when they watched them grow up. And a mother also, I think, always has a hope that if her kid goes wrong, they can change. And so she told me this story about Rashid literally, coming off the battlefield and calling her and saying, Mama, I need to ask you a question. My commander says that I can borrow his motorbike. Do you think it would be okay if I rode his motorbike? And this is a guy who just got off the battlefield in the Islamic State. And she started laughing because she was just like,
asking my permission now. Yeah.
And she was like so incredulous. And she was like, so she started joking with him. She's like, well, I guess if you wear your helmet and if you wear your, reflective gear and whatever, and they both started laughing. And, but the idea that, an ISIS fighter is calling his mom back in England to ask for permission to ride a motorcycle completely exploded my image, at least of this particular person. And
it's like a glimpse of the child that he was before this.
Yeah, and it's also an indication, I think, of one sort of strain of radicalization and recruitment, which is, you get naifs and you groom them. I mean, that's how a lot of recruiting, they're not all naifs. But certainly Rashid is one who, wanted to go help women and children in Syria. It wasn't like, he hated the West. It wasn't like he wanted to go kill people. There are, other folks who join for those reasons, but the real grooming, and I use the term advisedly because Nicola started using that, and then I kept hearing it, happens often with young kids who are, easy prey.
Right. So I wonder if you could give us a little bit more context on that. Rashid is one story, but I mean, one thing that's so striking in the book with all these different people you meet is that there are so many different pathways to radicalization. And I think that goes back to what you were saying at the beginning about wanting to sort of complexify this in a way, these stories, that there's not just one narrative, and I think I would have imagined that, someone who's going to leave a Western country to, run to Syria and join the ISIS kind of battlefield is going to be someone who's either been sort of, brought in under the idea of a real extreme sort of religiosity, where they're coming at it from a faith perspective that has gone really to the fringe, or, there's an ideological kind of whatever it may be, sympathy with the ISIS, agenda. But then here you're talking about this kid, Rashid, who's just like, I don't know, got suckered in and was always kind of this very easily led kid. So can you tell us, give us a little bit more context on that, and what are some of the other ways? I mean, is it real that some people come in through, the religious side or the ideological side? What are some of the different ways?
It's so funny because as class of 88, I am old enough, much older than you, to remember reporting in the reporting in the 90s, like from northern Pakistan, and going to these schools that we would call jihad factories, and poor kids were joining these schools and then being sent out. And I came out and I thought, aha, I know why people radicalize. It's poverty. We solve poverty and we will launch radicalization. And then, of course, 2 days later, I go down to Lahore and and sit down with a guy who's running a jihad training camp, who is wealthy, trained by the Green Berets, runs a garment factory, and is a weekend warrior up in Kashmir, training people. And he's a hardcore ideologue. He says, I said, look, if Kashmir is liberated, will you put down arms? And he's like, no, I'm going to continue until the whole world is Muslim. So there are ideologues, but ideology tends to be a lot less important than people think. There are also you can get ideology maybe later on when you're in it, but as a pushing point, like sitting down and having a very, jihad oriented interpretation of religious texts generally does. There's the famous, a lot of people roll up who are not religious at all, or who have such a basic and misguided notion of Islam that it's fun. There's the famous story of the guys who got on the plane, I think from Heathrow here, carrying a copy of the Quran for Dummies. So, and that is, when you start digging down, particularly in the Islamic State, which was kind of an equal opportunities, come one, come all, give us your homeless, your kind of outfit. It didn't, I think religion has something to do with it for some people, and it's naive to think that there aren't people who look to particular religious scholars. ISIS had its own scholars, and they were quoting, classical texts like pacifists do. But by and large, the causes are so many. You look at the UN guide on push and pull factors, and it's a map as big as the world. It's like everything from marginalization to personal trauma to anger at foreign policy to so it really is, when you see people radicalizing in our society, it's almost a kind of a map for what is going wrong in your society in many ways. Because they can appeal any weakness they want. These groups know how to tap into exactly what the weakness is, what people are wanting and lacking.
Right. And so, some of the stories are sort of what you or what I might have imagined, the kid who's just always struggled and never fit in and has been angry and then suddenly ends up in like that sort of fits what we might imagine more. But one of the most amazing ones was the family in Indonesia, where the whole family moved to Syria to join ISIS. And if I'm remembering correctly, one of the reasons was like that they would get better healthcare there. And was it the grandmother who might get like free medication or something?
Exactly.
It is so much more varied than I ever thought.
Yeah, and it is, and it's also much more optimistic too. Like there's, so that family had this unbelievable, bright and headstrong 16-year-old who started, going on these websites and suddenly was like, whoa, wouldn't it be cool if we all went to Syria and we could start again. Grandma, and this is not. Dad was a very successful civil servant. They lived a very comfortable upper middle class life. And she, her aspiration was, wouldn't this be an adventure? Wouldn't this be, we could be living as true Muslims rather than as, suburban bourgeoisie. And
Right.
you go through each member of their family, and they all, as they get worn down by her arguments, they all have different reasons, as you say, like,
Yeah.
we can go to medical, she tells her sister, we can go to med school for free, we'll
Right.
get better work life, dad won't have to work so hard, we'll get better work life balance,
Right.
and we'll be together as a family. So it's this, it's often a very seductive mix of, let's go back to the golden age of Islam, of the Prophet, but also, let's kind of get away from it all, kind of thing.
Right.
So that kind of bifurcated nostalgia,
Right. I mean,
and kind of optimism, and also then you can when you glom on the whole religious discourse,
Right.
you're gonna get rewards in the afterlife too. It's, to me,
Right.
when you start thinking about it and seeing these blogs luring people, you're like, oh, I get it. I get why people would I don't get it. Let me but
Right.
it's understandable.
And it's definitely not what I thought. I mean, that's one of the things that was so sort of eye-opening about this book. I didn't realize that ISIS was telling people, like, come here and you'll have a great job and medical care. So where does this lead you? As you said, that is more optimistic than some really dark thing where everybody's just sort of embracing this very nihilistic political or religious ideology. But where does that leave you in terms of de-radicalization and how to bring people back? And in particular, you go to a lot of different places in this book, a number of different European countries. You contrast with the US approach, and we're also going to get later to, majority Muslim countries, where the picture is different again. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you found in Denmark, and also what you see in the US, and maybe contrast those for us a little bit, and how do those two approaches to dealing with, returnees or sort of people who are potentially considering going, overseas to fight, or indeed staying home to fight. How do those approaches sort of, I mean, what do you learn about Denmark and the US by seeing how they approach this in terms of culture, safety net, all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I had a really interesting, so there's this very famous program in Denmark, in Aarhus, in a particular city,
Right.
where, and whose critics call it a sort of hug a terrorist program.
Right.
They literally like kill them with kindness kind of thing, like returning. There's this, sort of Hans Christian Andersen little yellow house where a detective sits, and,
Yeah.
returnees from the Islamic State or parents worried that their kids were radicalized and can drop by and drink a cup of coffee and talk things out. And literally this specialized police unit will, mentor these kids. And this is, Danish law has slightly changed since they were doing this, because when they were doing this, it wasn't a crime to have traveled to Syria. They hadn't clamped down on that. Right. So people could come back and sit, and, there's a burly detective, Thorleif Link, who is probably drunk more coffee with more terrorists than any other policeman in the Western world. And he works with them for years and years and years, and helps them find jobs, helps them find therapists, helps them find apartments. And this is all, of course, you can do this when you've got a welfare state, when the state kind of cradles you from cradle to grave.
Right. That's not going to happen in the US, is it?
No, it's not.
Right.
Exactly. And in the US,
you're not coming back from when you've gone to Syria to join ISIS. There's not a path back then, or is there?
Yeah, some people have, but both, but for example, in in the States, we immediately post 9/11 took a sort of securitized, I mean, the Danes see it as a social issue problem. Like, I talked to one detective and he was like, when I talk to these young people, I say to them, not what's your problem, but what is your problem? How can we help you? And the undercurrent is sort of, how could you possibly want to leave this welfare state wonderland? And there are all sorts of reasons, but and indeed, I should mention that Denmark has been really strict to the point of passing some really draconian laws. But in the States, we've always seen, the threat of Muslim terrorism as through security lenses. So immediately after, the idea is we go to war overseas.
Well, it's existential. It's an existential threat. And it has to be distinguished.
Crisis. It's about, they're trying, the dominant narrative, I shouldn't say everybody, but, is they're coming for Western civilization and they're gonna get us. And so, when you look at stuff, over the past, 5 or 6 years, there were, you could get locked up and possibly even 20 years for being a teenager who bragged stupidly to friends. You get in, you're talking trash off the basketball court, and you buy a ticket to Turkey, and you're stopped at the airport, and you haven't committed a crime. I mean, you have committed a crime, but the crime is talking trash to your friends about how you'd like to get out there and kill some people, and buying a ticket. So we had this huge pre-criminal space that made all sorts of ordinary activities suspect. There's this incredible list of things that can make you a person of interest in various cities across the states. And like, weirdly, I like, it's like, if you hear someone who is criticizing foreign policy, it'll get you, make you a suspect, just not locked up. But so we very much, and we're not into rehabilitation. We all know that from just the general prison population, that not compared to other countries. When you're locked up, there's not a lot of support there. And I saw that was very smart. So
and you have an incredible story in the book of a kid in, I think, Minneapolis, if I'm remembering correctly, who came very close on a lot of all this. But I think we're going to put that to the side for now, and people are going to have to read the book if they want to find that one. Because I want you to talk a little bit about Indonesia and Pakistan. In Indonesia, you actually went to a workshop for former jihadis to help them like reintegrate and find jobs and network and all of that, which is an incredible scene and chapter. But can you talk a little bit about how the context differs in majority Muslim countries? And again, this was a point in the book where you go to these different European countries, you go to Minneapolis, and then you sort of say, hey, wait a minute, here I am with my Western bias, thinking this is something that they, whatever, does to us, but actually, you're so much more likely to be the parent or the relative or whatever of a person who becomes, under the spell of some of these extremist Muslim ideologies if you're actually in a Muslim country. So can you talk a little bit about how that was different in Pakistan and Indonesia, and how it leads to different sort of paths out and a much greater openness, particularly in Indonesia, to sort of bringing people back?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the difference, particularly, well, in both places is, militancy, the militants haven't been racialized as others. They haven't been relatively recent immigrants, they are neighbors, friends, and relatives. And so the framing of jihadis in Indonesia is not as, evil, but as boys who have gone astray, and I use the term advisedly,
Right.
boys who have gone astray, who have got the wrong interpretation of Islam, and we have to bring them back. And so there's
Right.
this curious kind of cottage industry of nonprofits
Mhm.
that kind of work with these guys.
Mhm.
There's an extraordinary social entrepreneur, Huda Noor Ismail, who ran the workshop I attended, which was a workshop that had 4 generations of jihadis in a skyscraper hotel of the kind that some would have aspired to build. It was a 5-star hotel in the middle of Jakarta. And some of them would have aspired to blowing it up earlier. And we sat around and we did things like polishing their personal narratives so that they could give TED style talks, or learning filmmaking. And Huda's idea is that you've got to harness the things that got them into terrorism the first and put them in a
Right.
pro-social way. So he's like, look, jihadis tend to be charismatic, charismatic, loving to work in teams,
Mhm.
and driven. And he's like, they're the perfect entrepreneur. So
Right. Of course.
he set up a lot of these guys in their own businesses. So he set up one in a t-shirt making business, which folded after the guy was found to be printing Osama bin Laden t-shirts. And he set up another guy in a chauffeuring business, but he got lonely because he missed his buddies and the most successful businesses that he's got them involved with is restaurant work, because at a restaurant you have to serve absolutely everybody who comes to the door.
Right.
And so I met one former jihadi who was like, yeah, it was amazing. I was serving Christians, I was serving Buddhists, I was serving the policemen who had arrested me before, and I had them. So, so these kinds of programs are a far cry from the very tiny attempts at rehabilitation that we've done in the West, and it's yeah. So I'm seeing we have 6 minutes left.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. And we have a really good question. I want to, this question sort of brings us back to, I think, a question a lot of people will have in mind, and something that we raised at the beginning. It's from a Yalie we both know in Menlo Park, California, one of your most insightful readers, the lovely Rebecca Goldsmith. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
And Rebecca would like to hear your thoughts, and I would too, about what do we take from your reporting and from everything you've learned here to apply it to de-radicalization of the right in the US? And she says she's struck by your observation, and she's quoting from your book, that a country's approach to de-radicalization is often a Rorschach test of their culture. And I think you touched on some of that in the contrast of Denmark and the US before. But she also says the most successful de-radicalization programs that you highlight are based on relationships, talking, and proximity. So what hope is there for de-radicalization of homegrown American terrorists who don't live or work in proximity to their targets? And I think here we're getting back to the extreme polarization that we see in the US, and just this total separation and the real radicalization that we see, particularly on the right, and white supremacy and all of that in the last few years. So what can you offer us from your journey?
I think going forward, we're going to have to be really creative about thinking of ways for people to quite literally bump into each other and sit down and talk. It is way above my pay grade. I mean, I have thought about this and I've tried.
You can't fix it.
But it's, I look at successful things. I look at a mayor in Belgium who's successfully and successfully de-radicalized both a strong right wing and You know, his town was the only town where nobody left for the Islamic State in his sort of corridor
Right.
of train tracks in Belgium. And he you know, desecuritized the town in many ways. He did not want, he wanted the police to be there. He thought a lot about the built environment. He also thought a lot about trying to bring people together in strange ways. So he had, when the town had new immigrants, they would have a speed dating, they'd have a buddy, and they would talk. I don't know how it works in a country as big and disparate as the United States. And but it's interesting to me that people don't seem to be thinking about how our geography and our built environments, where everybody's isolated, you know, where vast numbers of Americans are isolated in communities and sitting in the dark and stabbing at their keyboards, as opposed to going into the public square. I mean, that along with the unraveling of the news media, where we're all listening, you know, we can go into Facebook and stuff like that, but where we're all listening to our echo chambers is for crumbling. And I'm not saying anything new there. But I think we have to be creative. We have to think about it in ways that aren't being talked about now, which is, you know, thinking about radicalism, thinking about being attracted to the violent groups as maybe a public health issue, thinking about it as opposed to a security issue, thinking about it ways to lessen loneliness. So that, but believe me, I'm as stumped as anyone on this. But I do think places like Pakistan, where militancy has been really marbled into the national fabric, particularly in particular parts of Pakistan, where literally, you know, women were having to stop their brothers or fathers or sons from becoming suicide bombers. That it would behoove us to listen to the folks on the front line there, because they have had to deal with their neighbors becoming violent extremists, and so how to
maybe someone in rural America or whatever is going to be de-radicalized by their neighbor, not by, you know, someone in Brooklyn or whatever.
Top-down programs don't work. You know, the landscape is littered with really horrible ideas that came out of you know, legislatures far away from the local. The more local and long-term you can go, the more you can build community solidarity. You're going to see a virtuous circle emerging, I think, if it's anything other like the successful programs that I've seen.
And you did, as far as right-wing radicalization goes, we didn't have time to talk about this, but you did spend some time in Germany, which obviously sort of, you know, from its past and its Nazi history, has focused really hard on trying to de-radicalize people on the right and bring neo-Nazis back from extremism. So maybe there's some lessons there too, but you all will have to read the book for that. We have one more. This
was my cunning plan. Run down the clock.
Yes.
So people.
We have one more question, audience question, that I think is going to be a good one to end on. So let's go to that. It's from Kyle Wang. Kyle says, you mentioned tribal conflicts driven by tribalism, and leaders of radical movements are not usually chasing economic gains. They are ideologues. How can humanity lift itself above its various ideologies and above your way of life or my way of life to focus on common humanity? How can we put each of our moral convictions aside to see ourselves as humans? Is love and compassion the core agent for this? Then, if this is impossible, is the world peace a permanent elusive dream, or it can only be secured by balance of power? But I think that the question about sort of seeing each other's humanity is very central to your book, because as we were talking about, you are looking for humanity in people that are or have done terrible things sometimes and are seen
Absolutely.
very widely as monsters. So do you want to?
I should just correct Kyle there. And I'm sorry if I misspoke. I do think a lot of the leaders are not in it for ideological. I think this is power politics in a vast majority of cases. They're in it for money and power, you know. So, but I completely agree with you that you know, we have to allow for, we have to look for the banality of evil in a way. As Hannah Arendt said, you know, we have to try to dig down and understand the human needs, ranging from wanting to belong, wanting to be involved in an important fight, to wanting a better life-work balance, and understanding that. And until we do try to see the humanity in all these people, some of whom made terrible choices, we're going to be circling back to the securitized framework, and
definitely not working.
Which is not working, exactly. As the last couple of months certainly have shown us. So yeah.
Great. Well, Carla, this has been so great. I really love talking to you. I just want to show this to everyone again, and we just really scratched the surface, but you know, the human stories in there, and the people that you found, the Hannah Arendt quote. I mean, you said at one point, I think, that we don't allow terrorists banality now. We don't allow them to be banal. And that is a level of humanity in a way, that they are sometimes motivated by, you know, really basic things, and actually that does offer some hope, because there's something you can connect with there. Exactly.
And the best programs are there digging down. I mean, when I talk to a German guy who works with neo-Nazis, you know, that he says, we do not accept the Nazi ideas in you, but we do accept you as a human being. And that's sort of their kind of, you know, baseline motto. And it seemed a useful thing to frame what we should all strive for.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for this, and thank you for this amazing book. I mean, it is just such a gift, because it's so it's just so elegantly written, and you've taken us so deep on something that I think, you know, just really lends a very, very new and different perspective to a topic that, you know, we've spent more than kind of 20 years hearing of a very familiar, you know, approach to. So thank you for the book. Thanks for the conversation. It's been really fun. And I think I'm gonna now hand it back to Caroline to take us out.
Really fantastic. My gosh. Thank you so much, Carla and Beth, for this absolutely illuminating session on deradicalization. And thank you all for being here, especially as we face a rising tide of polarized thinking and behavior around the world. If you have further questions for Carla, please contact her at our website. She's at carlapower.com, or email YIA, Yale International Alliance @gmail.com. And do keep an eye out for our upcoming YIA events and register on the YIA website. And with all of this amazing, inspirational, eye-opening hour, I'd like to wish everybody a peaceful and nurturing weekend. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. Bye.